They buried the truth under blood-stained stone, and for over a century, no one dared to dig. But now, you're about to hear the secret Brazil was never meant to remember. In 1854, deep within the rotting heart of colonial São Paulo, there stood a convent older than the Republic itself, Santa Muerte de la Misericordia. Locals avoided it, not for what it was, but for what it hid. At night, its walls wept. Screams leaked into alleyways like poison mist, yet no records survive, no investigations, no names, except one, Catalina Rojas. You've never heard of her. That's by design. Long before Brazil legalized freedom, before the empire collapsed under its own decay, Catalina walked the earth like a phantom. Her story was erased not because it wasn't true, but because it was too true, too primal, too horrifying. She wasn't called a killer in her time. They had no language for women like her. In the brittle official archives, she's labeled a midwife, a healer, but in the unofficial records, letters buried by clergy, torn diary pages smuggled from dying nuns, she's something else entirely, a manipulator, a blood surgeon, a master of spiritual anatomy, and by 1862, she had turned a convent into a death house. But she didn't use knives. She used faith. Catalina was not born wicked. She was forged in wickedness, molded by forces darker than steel. Born to a priest and an enslaved herbalist, she was orphaned during a fever plague and left to die in the refuse pits outside Belém. When she was discovered days later, alive, silent, staring, her hair had turned bone white, though she was only 8. Touched by God, they said. Possessed, said others, but all agreed. Catalina was different. By 16, she could quote scripture in Latin, twist it into spells in Yoruba, and mimic the exact vocal cadence of any priest. By 20, she was headmistress of the Misericordia convent, and that's when the disappearances began. But this isn't just a story of murder. It's a descent into an institutional machine that enabled her, a religious empire that cloaked her in sanctity while she twisted souls into silence, a nation that needed monsters like her to keep its shadows undisturbed. This is the story of Catalina Rojas, Brazil's first serial killer, and the secret she discovered beneath the convent floor still haunts the land today. Keep watching, but understand this, once you hear what comes next, you don't get to unknow it. By the time the first girl went missing, no one even noticed. She was a novitiate, 15 years old, sent to the convent after her father drank himself to death and her mother sold the family's land to cover debts. Her name was Joanna. Quiet, dutiful, invisible. That made her perfect. Catalina didn't kill for rage, or lust, or greed. She killed to understand. And Joanna was her first lesson. It began with confession. Catalina had a method. First, isolation. She'd assign the novitiate long hours in the candle crypt, alone, surrounded by bones of dead sisters, under the pretext of spiritual preparation. The darkness would get into their minds, but that was the point. Then came the questions. What sins lie in your bloodline? Have your dreams changed? Always whispered, always late at night. She studied their eyes, measured their fear. She believed fear was a doorway, and Joanna opened easily. Joanna disappeared on the third Sunday of Advent. The convent bell rang for morning prayer, but her bed was cold, untouched. Catalina told the sisters she had run away, troubled by temptation. The abbess accepted it without question. Catalina had cultivated an image of divine discipline. They saw her as a necessary blade, cutting weakness from the vine. But Joanna hadn't run. She was beneath the floor, in a pit Catalina had carved with her own hands under the altar of Saint Apollonia. Catalina believed in sacrifice, but not in the way Scripture taught. To her, pain was not punishment, it was purification. She kept Joanna alive for days, speaking prayers as she bled her in controlled increments. Not a drop wasted. She wrote her reactions down in code. S2R N6HR irregular after 17 drops. Pulse +3, no weeping yet. Like she was mapping the soul, and the church never questioned a thing. Why would they? The country was collapsing, slavery still gripped the land, the empire was fragile, held together by whispered pacts and broken backs. The church needed order, and Catalina provided it. Her methods were cruel, yes, but effective. No rebellion stirred within her walls, no scandal escaped. In a world where women were meant to be silent and pure, Catalina was neither, and that's why they feared her, but not enough to stop her. One girl gone, no punishment, no justice, just silence. And silence is where evil thrives. Evil rarely walks alone. By 1857, 3 more novitiates had vanished, each time under different excuses. One sent home for mental instability, another taken by fever, a third reassigned to a mission post in Bahia. Not a single family received a letter, not a single authority knocked on the convent gates. Because Catalina had learned something ancient, something the inquisitors knew, something governments still use. If you control the narrative, you control reality. The convent became her laboratory. She adjusted her methods. With Joanna, she had used fear, but with Maria, her second subject, she used devotion. She manipulated prayer, twisting it, breaking it, weaponizing it. She convinced Maria that suffering was divine, that agony was a language angels spoke. It worked. Maria thanked her. By the end, she believed her punishment was love. This was no ordinary cruelty. Catalina wasn't just taking lives, she was converting pain into ritual. Her journals, later discovered behind the fresco of the Virgin, detail step-by-step processes. Application of cold to silence rebellion. Scripture recitation during laceration reduces shock. Singing hymns while bleeding slows heart rate. Mind separation confirmed after 4th day. She was dissecting the human spirit and building a system. But here's the part they never want you to understand. She didn't act alone. The abbess knew, at least partially. So did Father Melchior, the confessor for the convent. He signed the transfer papers for the vanished girls. He praised Catalina for her uncompromising moral vigilance. He dined with her weekly. The institution didn't just tolerate her, they needed her. Because Catalina kept order in a time of chaos. Rebellions were sparking across Brazil. Enslaved men were rising. The monarchy was weakening. The church clung to its power like a dying animal, clawing through blood and dogma. Catalina offered something better than prayer. Control. She shaped the young girls into obedient vessels. Quiet, empty, hollow. And in return, the church looked away. Just as it always has. Just as it still does. This is the truth no one wants to admit. Institutions don't fear evil. They fear exposure. Catalina Rojas didn't hide in the shadows. She was the shadow, draped in lace, drenched in incense, whispering benedictions with blood still on her hands. And the worst part? She believed she was saving them. What do you call a monster that prays before it kills? Catalina knelt before the crucifix before every session, her lips moving in Latin, her face calm, serene. She believed each act of suffering she inflicted was a step closer to purification, not just for her victims, but for herself. By 1858, she had begun carving scripture into the walls of the cellar chapel, verses altered subtly, wickedly. Those who suffer shall be made whole became, those who suffer shall be made mine. She was building her own religion beneath the convent, brick by brick, bone by bone. And it was growing. The other nuns never entered the lowest chambers. They weren't allowed. Catalina said it was where penitents meditated, and that too much contact would dilute the sanctity. In truth, the walls were soundproofed with horsehair and clay, a room designed to devour screams, a chamber engineered for silence. It was in this silence that she created her doctrine. She believed pain unveiled the truth of the soul, that by stripping away the body's resistance she could glimpse what lay beneath, a primal divine spark unclouded by the ego. She didn't see herself as a killer, she saw herself as a midwife, birthing enlightenment through torment. The girls she purified were never buried together. Catalina dispersed the remains across consecrated sites, the garden well, the crypt of forgotten saints beneath the chapel tiles. One skull was found decades later inside the base of a candle holder, hollowed out, filled with wax. Catalina had turned the holy into the horrific. But still, no one came. No investigation, no trial. Why? Because she had built a wall of power around herself, politicians sent their daughters to the convent. Bishops praised her discipline, donations flowed in, and anyone who whispered otherwise was quickly labeled mad, sinful, or both. This is how evil survives, not in secrecy, but in sanctity. Catalina was untouchable because she wore the mask of virtue, and the deeper her crimes went, the more the institution needed her silenced, not stopped. Because once a system benefits from a monster, it becomes the monster's accomplice. Remember that. You're not just hearing about a serial killer, you're hearing about the blueprint of psychological control, the same one used by cults, by governments, by corporations. Even now, this is what they don't want you to see. Keep watching. You're not falling into darkness, you're waking up inside it. The first outsider to question her was a physician. Dr. Alvaro Mendez, a Lisbon-trained surgeon, had been sent to the convent in 1859 to examine Sister Celeste, a novice who had collapsed during morning prayers. Catalina tried to dismiss him at the gate, citing cloister rules. But the girl's breathing was shallow, her fingernails blue, and the bishop had signed the order himself. He entered the walls. What he found was not illness. It was starvation. Bruises hidden beneath robes, ligature marks on ankles, a brand, faint but unmistakable, just above the collarbone in the shape of a crucifix turned upside down. He documented everything. He returned 3 days later with 2 assistants, but Sister Celeste was gone. Transferred, Catalina said, to a monastery hospital in Recife, but no records were ever found. Dr. Mendez didn't believe her. He wrote letters, first to the local diocese, then to the archbishop in Salvador. No response. He went to the civil magistrate, a man with 3 daughters currently studying at the convent. Suddenly Alvaro was discredited, accused of medical fraud, his license revoked. 1 week later he vanished. His house ransacked, his clinic shuttered. The only clue was his journal, pages torn, except for one entry that survived in a broken drawer. She doesn't punish, she prepares. These girls, they're not victims, they're offerings. That phrase, she prepares, was later found carved in Latin above the crypt's stone threshold. Parat immolationem. She prepares the sacrifice. You still think this is just a story? Ask yourself, how many girls must disappear before a pattern becomes a truth? How many witnesses must vanish before silence is considered a signal? Catalina didn't bury her secrets in the dark. She displayed them in plain sight. She dared the world to look and watched as it turned away. Because when evil wears lace and scree, pure people kneel instead of run. And here's the most disturbing part. After Mendez disappeared, no one else came. For 17 more years, Catalina operated without interruption. The convent expanded. A new East Wing was built. Donors praised the exemplary discipline of the sisters. And young girls kept arriving, silent, obedient, already broken. What you're hearing isn't just history, it's a ritual repeating itself. Over and over again. You are not just learning about Catalina Rojas. You are learning how darkness survives behind stained glass and whispered hymns, and how easily we mistake it for light. There was one girl who didn't break. Her name was Ana Lucia, 12 years old, from Fortaleza. Her mother, a laundress. Her father, unknown. They called her La Chispa, the spark, because she asked too many questions. She arrived at the convent in 1862, sent by a priest who said her soul needed discipline. But Ana Lucia wasn't like the others. She listened, she watched, and she remembered everything. Within 2 weeks, she'd learned the schedules. Who swept the cloisters, which nun took the keys at night, where the rats came in beneath the pantry wall. She knew which herbs made you sleep, and which ones made you sick. She whispered the names of the missing girls to herself like prayers before bed. Then came her turn. Catalina summoned her after midnight, something they called the calling. It always began with incense. Then came the questions, but Catalina didn't want answers. She wanted surrender. That's what Ana Lucia realized. The silence was the offering. So Ana gave her something else. Defiance. She smiled, just once, but Catalina saw it, and in that instant, something cracked. Catalina didn't scream. She didn't strike her. She leaned close and whispered, "I know who you are. You've been here before." Ana didn't understand, but Catalina's voice was full of something she hadn't shown to any of the other girls. Fear. The next morning, Ana Lucia was gone. The sisters were told she'd been sent home, but no one ever came for her. No carriage was seen leaving, no letter arrived, except 2 weeks later, a piece of cloth was found behind the statue of St. Margaret in the lower chapel. Torn linen, inside it, sewn by hand, were 6 names. Names of girls who had disappeared, along with a final line, "There is a tunnel beneath the prayer room. They take us through the earth." The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Ana Lucia's. Catalina never mentioned her gente, but something had shifted. From that year onward, the rituals became more secretive. The chapel was closed at night. No more novices allowed past the altar after dusk. And the punishments, for even small disobedience, became surgical. No records remain of what happened to Ana Lucia. But she left behind a spark. And when a spark lands in dry silence, sometimes it becomes fire. In 1863, a fire did break out. Not literal flame, but something far more dangerous. A rumor. It started in a market near the harbor of Salvador. A dockhand claimed his sister had seen a pale girl with no tongue wandering barefoot in the alley behind the convent's outer wall. She wore no veil, no shoes, only a blood-soaked nightgown and a rosary made of hair. The story spread fast, too fast. Vendors whispered it between baskets of mangoes. Street preachers shouted it from corners. By sundown it had mutated. Now the girl was an angel, now a demon, now the Virgin herself, weeping blood for the children lost behind holy stone. And Catalina? She didn't blink. She ordered the outer wall whitewashed, increased daily prayers, locked the cellar doors with chains that hadn't been used since the plague years. But fear is a strange force. The more you deny it, the more it sharpens its teeth. Then came the second sighting. A merchant's wife swore she saw 2 figures near the convent's rear gate. Girls, hand in hand, moving like sleepwalkers, eyes wide open but blank. No one believed her, until her son was found unconscious the next morning, clutching a piece of stained cloth bearing the convent's seal. Suddenly, silence wasn't enough. Catalina went underground. Literally, she reopened the tunnel Ana Lucia had written about. It had been there for decades, carved originally by Portuguese monks during the Dutch invasions. A narrow serpentine passage beneath the prayer room, leading to an abandoned chapel a mile away, long overtaken by vines and ghosts. She began moving the girls. Not all of them, just the ones who glowed, as she called it, the ones whose minds bent easily under pressure. She called them her choir. They weren't taught scripture. They were taught obedience through sensation, cold, starvation, isolation, but also praise, kisses to the forehead, long, whispered benedictions. Catalina understood something even doctors of the time hadn't yet published. To break a person's will, you must fracture the boundary between love and pain. And once broken, that boundary doesn't heal. It reforms around the abuser. The church still said nothing. They called her methods radical discipline, quietly approved, quietly ignored. But outside those walls, people were starting to watch. They couldn't name it yet, but something rotted inside that holy place. And rot, once it starts, spreads. By the spring of 1864, the city of Salvador had shifted. The streets were still sunlit, the bells still rang. But beneath it all was a tension, a thickness in the air, as if the city was holding its breath. Catalina noticed it too. She began hosting evening services, not for the girls, but for the townspeople. Incense-heavy masses with Latin hymns and faint candlelight, where she delivered sermons that sounded more like lullabies than lessons. She spoke of obedience, of suffering as a pathway to holiness, of how pain, properly guided, could purify the soul. And people listened, not because they believed, but because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't. It wasn't just rumors now. One fisherman claimed he found a small child tangled in his net, alive but pale as milk, with ligature marks around her ankles. She didn't speak. She didn't blink. When the authorities came, the girl had vanished. A beggar boy swore he saw cloaked figures burying something near the cliffs by moonlight. When they returned the next day, the ground had been smoothed over. No trace remained, except a single black rosary, half-melted, tucked beneath a flat stone. The convent was becoming untouchable, not holy, not feared, untouchable. The people of Salvador began avoiding the hill altogether. Carriages turned away. Vendors crossed themselves as they passed. Even priests from neighboring parishes started whispering Catalina's name with unease. Yet no one dared intervene. Why? Because the church kept her protected. Because wealth flowed from that convent like a silent river, gold, paintings, and sacred relics donated from families whose daughters never returned from retreat. And because Catalina had learned how to use confession as a weapon. She kept secrets, filthy ones, men who violated orphans, women who poisoned their husbands, soldiers who deserted, burned farms, brib, dead bishops, all confessed in her chapel, all knelt before her, all left with sins forgiven. But Catalina never forgot. She kept records, not on paper, but in the minds of her choir. The girls remembered everything. That was her design. Each girl trained to absorb, to witness, to hold the darkness of others until they themselves became shadows. But what Catalina never considered was what happens when a shadow turns around and looks back, because one of them did. And that was the beginning of the end. Her name was Isadora, the youngest of the Granger quadruplets, the quietest, the one who never spoke above a whisper, not even when the others cried at night, not even when Catalina traced her collarbone with that cold silver crucifix she always wore like a brand of ownership. Isadora was the watcher. While the others obeyed, she observed. She watched the faces of the confessors, watched the trembling hands of the women who brought offerings to the altar, watched the way Catalina's lips curved, not in piety, but pleasure, whenever pain entered the room. And slowly, Isadora began remembering too much. At first it was innocent. A name spoken twice, a bishop's secret muttered after midnight, a locked drawer in Catalina's study, opened once, then never again. But soon the memories came in floods. She began waking in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, whispering things no girl her age should know, descriptions of rituals she hadn't attended, conversations she hadn't heard, details about the rosary murders from 5 towns over. It was as if something had been planted in her, and now it was beginning to grow. The other sisters noticed. One evening, during evening hymns, Isadora sang a verse that no one had taught her, ancient, Latinized, and chilling. The candles flickered. 2 girls fainted. Catalina stood motionless, her jaw clenched, eyes locked on the child as if seeing her for the first time. From that night forward, Isadora was separated, no longer allowed to eat with the others. Her bed was moved to the chapel, beneath the statue of St. Agnes, where Catalina could keep her close. She was forbidden to speak, forbidden to look at anyone, and most of all, she was forbidden to write. Because Catalina knew. She knew what was happening, knew that Isadora's mind was no longer hers to control, knew that whatever she'd implanted in the girls was returning through this one. A seed had awakened, and now it threatened to tear down everything. But Catalina didn't panic. She doubled down. More masses, longer confessions, harsher punishments. She believed fear would strangle whatever spirit had begun to rise in that child. But what she didn't understand was that Isadora wasn't just remembering. She was channeling something ancient, something furious. And it had come to end her. By the autumn of 1880, the air around the Granger estate began to rot. Not with the scent of death, that would have been too obvious, but with something far worse. Doubt. Quiet, creeping, like black mold behind a gilded wall. The kind of doubt that no hymn could wash clean. It began with the mirrors. One by one, they cracked. Not shattered, cracked. Long, thin fractures down the center like veins through glass. In the study. In the chapel. In the guest hallway where the bishop once stayed. Every mirror fractured, but only when Isadora entered the room. Then came the birds. Dead crows, one each morning, left neatly on the threshold of the west wing. Wings splayed, beaks open, eyes plucked clean, as if offering themselves in silence. Catalina ordered them burned, but each day another appeared. The house was changing. The staff began whispering. The maids reported footsteps in the walls. The cook claimed her name was spoken at midnight by a voice not human. Father Joseph, the young priest brought in to assist Catalina, was found sobbing in the library, rocking back and forth, mumbling prayers in reversed Latin. He left the next day, refusing to explain. And through it all, Isadora watched. She said nothing, did nothing, just stared, calm, composed, as if she were waiting for something only she could hear. Catalina refused to break. She held private masses for the girl each evening, forced her to kneel for hours, to recite verses from forbidden texts, to fast until her lips turned blue. She believed the spirit inside Isadora could be exorcised, that the girl was a vessel, a flaw in an otherwise perfect experiment. But she was wrong. Isadora wasn't a vessel. She was a mirror. She reflected everything Catalina buried, every unconfessed sin, every ritual gone too far, every soul traded under holy guise. And now, like the mirrors of the estate, Catalina was beginning to fracture. She stopped sleeping, kept candles burning in every room, ordered the chapel boarded shut, and still she could feel it, watching. From beneath the floorboards, behind the crucifixes, inside Isadora's eyes. The house, the sacred temple she'd spent her life building, was turning against her, and the spirit within Isadora was not coming for redemption. It was coming for justice. The kind heaven never offers, but hell remembers. By winter, the house had fallen into silence, a suffocating, unnatural hush that blanketed the Granger estate like snow over a forgotten grave. Even the wind seemed afraid to pass through the gates. What once echoed with organ hymns and ritual chants now felt more like a tomb with wallpaper, and at the center of it all stood Isadora, unchanged, untouched. She no longer spoke unless spoken to, no longer wept, no longer ate in the presence of others. Catalina kept her isolated in the third-floor prayer room, chained at the ankles, surrounded by relics stolen from 7 different cathedrals, holy water, saint bones, handwritten scripture from a dead pope. None of it worked, because nothing was possessing Isadora. The evil wasn't in her. The evil had been made for her, and now it lived through her, like an echo from the sins of another. The servants began quitting, first the cook, then the maid who had raised the girl since birth. When asked why, they offered only one word: her. No one needed clarification. Catalina became more desperate. She sent for physicians. 3 refused. The 4th examined Isadora and left without taking his coat off. He didn't charge a fee, didn't speak a word, just walked to his carriage and vanished down the frost-laced road like he'd glimpsed something best left unspoken. That night, Catalina attempted a binding ritual, the same kind she used to secure the loyalty of bishops and donors alike. It involved fire, blood, the old Granger seal, etched into the girl's skin with a hot iron cross. Isadora didn't scream. She didn't even blink. Instead, she whispered something. Just one word, a name, not hers. Catalina's. And that was when the lights exploded. The candles, the gas lanterns, every source of light in the house, gone in a single breath. The temperature dropped, the walls groaned, and somewhere far beneath the floor, a sound rose. Not a scream, not a growl. Something inhuman, ancient, like stone dragged across bone. Catalina fled the room, slamming the door shut behind her, but the silence didn't return this time. Now, the house whispered. It whispered her name, again and again and again, as if the spirit had finally chosen its prey. And it wasn't the girl. It was the woman who had built this empire of ash. The next morning, Catalina found a crucifix nailed upside down to the main gate. No footsteps in the snow, no sign of intrusion, just that wooden cross, ancient, cracked, and smeared with something brownish-black, dried blood or rot, no one could say. Catalina ordered it removed. By sundown, it reappeared, inside the house, hung over Isadora's bed. That was when Catalina stopped sleeping. She paced the halls at night, rosary clutched in her fist like a weapon, her eyes hollowed out. Her voice, once commanding, grew brittle, cracked with fear, and when the priests stopped returning her letters, she began reading from forbidden books, texts once locked away in the family crypt beneath the chapel. She swore they weren't there before. She swore they hadn't been written in Latin, but in something older. Even the ink smelled wrong, like copper, like wounds. Each night, Isadora sat motionless at the foot of her bed, murmuring things in a voice that wasn't quite her own. Sometimes it was a whisper. Other times, a deep masculine chant in a dialect no one recognized. When asked to stop, she'd smile, and the air would shift. So heavy it was hard to breathe. One of the servants, a boy barely 16, claimed he saw Isadora standing at the edge of the forest around midnight, naked, pale, motionless. But when he called out to her, she opened her mouth wide, too wide, until it tore at the corners. And then she vanished. He left the same night, left everything he owned behind. Catalina no longer cared. Her obsession had shifted from saving Isadora to understanding what she had become. She locked herself in the prayer room for 3 days with the girl. No food, no water, no rest. Just those books, those candles, and the soft humming that echoed from the girl's throat like a lullaby sung by the dead. When she finally emerged, Catalina looked different. Not just tired, hollowed, like something had been taken from her, like she'd made a trade. She didn't speak, didn't blink, just walked straight into the chapel, collapsed before the altar, and whispered, it was never her. And from that day forward, she called Isadora Mother. The family never recovered, because from that point on, the house was no longer theirs. It belonged to whatever had crawled up through the floorboards and taken its throne. The new Isadora did not smile, she observed. Her eyes followed each soul in the room as though she were seeing through them, not at them. When she walked, she did not blink. When she stood still, the air around her seemed to hum, like 1,000 whispers just outside the range of human hearing. And when she spoke, people listened, not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't help it. Her voice no longer matched her age, or her body, or this world. It was ancient, slow, measured, drenched in something that sounded like wisdom, but reeked of something else. The remaining family began leaving. Some fled in the night. Others died mysteriously. Sudden hemorrhaging, violent seizures. 2 were found drowned in dry bathtubs, mouths agape, eyes blackened. The servants didn't even pack. They simply ran. But Catalina stayed. She became a shadow of herself, trailing behind the girl, watching, serving, protecting. Her eyes, once regal, once fierce, had dulled. Her spine was bent, her voice was monotone, and she never used Isadora's name again. She only called her the vessel. The townsfolk grew frightened. They whispered of black smoke rising from the estate at dusk, of music, low, droning hymns in unearthly tones, of strange lights in the woods and animals going missing. Some brave men tried to intervene. 3 hunters armed with rifles and scripture marched to the manor. They never came back. A week later, the rifles were found at the tree line. Still loaded, still clean, still warm. The priest who had baptized Isadora returned from the city, intent on confronting the madness. He brought with him holy water, sacred relics, and 3 nuns trained in rites of exorcism. They stayed exactly 11 minutes. When they ran screaming from the house, the priest was no longer with them. He was later discovered locked in the crypt beneath the chapel, blind, tongue remo, with fingernails etched with ancient symbols. He was still alive, but he never spoke again. Back in town, people stopped saying the name Granger. Children were warned to never look toward the manor after nightfall, and a new phrase began to circulate, one that crept through the region like a ghost in a nursery rhyme. The 4th was never born. She was released. No one could explain it, but everyone understood it, because deep in their bones, even the skeptics felt it. Something had come back, and it was no longer pretending to be human. The sky over Granger Hollow changed, not in the way a storm rolls in or the seasons shift. No, this was more subtle, more psychological. The light itself began to feel wrong, too pale during the day, too orange at dusk. Even the stars overhead lost their alignment, constellations twisted, ancient patterns broken. The land responded first. Fields that once yielded lush corn and barley turned dry and brittle. Crops died mid-bloom. Livestock gave birth to stillborns with twisted limbs. The soil darkened, took on a smell of copper and rot. Even the birds, robins, crows, sparrows, all disappeared. And through it all, the girl with the dead sisters roamed the estate barefoot, her white nightdress always clean, always glowing faintly. No one saw her eat. No one saw her sleep. Some claimed she wandered into the forest at night, returning only at dawn, dragging behind her lengths of vine, bones, and once, something that looked suspiciously like human hair. The authorities were called. Not the sheriff. He had vanished months prior, last seen walking toward the manor with a Bible in hand and tears in his eyes. No, this time it was a federal marshal. A hard man, decorated, known for cleaning up cult towns and border nightmares. He came with 3 men and a pack of bloodhounds. They entered the Granger estate on September 12, 1876. By sunrise, only the dogs came back. 2 of them were blind. The 3rd had ripped its own throat open on a barbed fence post before collapsing in the churchyard. The marshal's journal was recovered 3 days later. It had been buried in a child's grave behind the manor, beneath a wooden cross with no name. His final entry read, "She is not a girl. She is a mirror the devil holds up to God, and every time someone looks into her, they see a future we were never meant to glimpse." From that moment on, no outsider dared enter Granger Hollow. Peace began omitting the town altogether. Stagecoaches rerouted, letters stopped arriving. It was as if the land itself wanted to erase the Grangers from memory, but memory is stubborn, especially when it's tied to horror, and those who lived nearby still heard things, even decades later. The sound of children singing in reverse, the bell in the manor tower ringing at 3:33 a.m., and the laughter of a girl who should never have lived. By 1877, Granger Hollow was no longer on any map, but evil doesn't need coordinates to thrive. It simply needs roots, and the Grangers had planted theirs deep. Something had changed in the neighboring towns, too. Children were born with unusual eyes, too wide, too bright. Men woke up with scratches across their chests and no memory of where they had been, and the churches, once filled with hymns, now echoed with silence. The priests wouldn't go near the place. Even those who believed themselves chosen by God would falter when standing within miles of that rotted land. Crosses would fall from walls, holy water boiled in its basins. One priest, Father Reuben from the next town over, attempted an exorcism from afar. He locked himself in the chapel with relics, prayer scrolls, and salt. By dawn, the townspeople found him hanging upside down from the chapel's rafters, mouth sewn shut with human hair. They buried him in 3 coffins. And still, the whispers came. Some said the Granger girl, now a teenager, was no longer alone. That she had been multiplying, like cells in a disease. That travelers passing through sometimes saw 3 or 4 identical girls walking in unison, wearing white, heads tilted, eyes glazed like glass. They would not speak, only stare. Others claimed they had seen her in dreams, even if they had never set foot near the hollow. Dreams that began with a lullaby and ended with fire. A former schoolteacher from the next county arrived at the local sheriff's station, shaking and disoriented. He kept mumbling, "She taught me the numbers. She taught me the numbers." When asked what he meant, he began carving into his arm 4 numbers over and over again, 1876, the year it all began. They locked him in an asylum. He was the 5th person that year to do the same. But it wasn't just madness spreading, it was memory, collective and ancient, being erected. Something about the quadruplets, about what they were, was tearing a hole in the fabric of reality itself. And behind that tear, something was watching, something not of this world, something older than the Grangers, older than language, a force that had once been banished but now had found a vessel in 4 bodies that should never have existed. The townsfolk called them the Sisters of the Hollow, but in hushed voices, they began calling them something else. The 4 warnings. The Granger homestead was now surrounded by silence, not emptiness, but tension, like a breath held by the earth itself. Trees leaned away from the house. Animals refused to go near. No crows, no wolves, not even the insects dared crawl along its walls. Inside, the house was rotting, but the girls were not. They remained unchanged, untouched by time. 4 identical faces, 4 identical gazes. No aging, no illness, no scars. Their eyes gleamed like frost beneath moonlight, but it wasn't just their appearance that unsettled people. It was the feeling in the air when you looked at them, like you were being measured. There were reports from the one surviving doctor who had visited the house in late '78, Dr. Eloise Harland, a woman of strict science and no tolerance for superstition. She believed the girls were a biological anomaly, nothing more. But when she returned from her visit, she was changed. She didn't sleep. She didn't blink. She began building strange machines in her basement. Diagrams of non-Euclidean geometries lined her walls, circles within circles, doors that led to nowhere. She claimed the girls had taught her how to see, not with her eyes, but with her blood. On the 7th night, she burned her own clinic down and walked into the Granger woods. She was never found. Her notes, salvaged from the fire, were a mess of scribbled formulas and disturbing phrases. There are 4, but there is one. Time bends around them. They are hosts, not origin. I saw my mother inside one of them, but she's been dead 10 years. They remember things they never lived. This last sentence would echo across future investigations. The Granger girls seemed to remember lives that weren't theirs, events they couldn't possibly know. They spoke in tongues never heard before. At times in perfect Latin, other times in dialects that didn't match any known lingua G. And then came the fireflies. Tens of thousands of them, appearing only around the Granger house, glowing red instead of yellow. Local farmers said they formed symbols in the air, sigils, ancient and terrible. It was no longer just a haunting, no longer a mystery. It was a phenomenon. The Granger quadruplets weren't merely unnatural, they were impossible. A contradiction made flesh. And with each passing day, they were becoming more aware of what they were. By the spring of 1879, the Granger estate had become a magnet, not for the curious, but for the disturbed. Priests arrived first, then came mystics, then came men who carried no names, only credentials from secret organizations. They spoke in whispers, their questions sharp, their eyes colder than the girls themselves. One group claimed to be from Harvard, another from the Royal Society. A third refused to even state their country of origin. But all of them asked the same question. Do they dream? And when they were told yes, that the girls often spoke of vivid dreams, dreams of cities made of bone, oceans of black glass, and skies that bled ash, they all responded the same way. They turned pale, and they left. None ever returned. But the most chilling visitor of all arrived in late May, a blind man named Bartholomew Creed, escorted by 4 silent women dressed in mourning black. He said nothing as he approached the Granger girls. He didn't flinch when their heads turned in unison to face him. He simply removed his gloves, held out his hands, and they reached back, together, as if greeting an old friend. They whispered something in unison. One word. Nerezza, Italian, meaning darkness. Creed collapsed instantly. No pulse, but no signs of death. For hours his body remained stiff, mouth open in awe or terror, no one could tell. When he finally stirred, he uttered a single phrase before walking into the woods barefoot, vanishing forever. "They are not children, they are what comes after." That sentence, recorded by the sheriff's deputy, would be quoted for decades, because no one, not even the government officials who would later intervene, could explain what was happening at the Granger house. The land surrounding it began to decay. Crops turned black, wells ran dry, birds migrated early and never returned. Even the moon seemed to hang heavier over that patch of earth like a watchful eye. But the girls thrived. They began drawing symbols in the dust. They began staring at the horizon at exact times, midnight, 3:33 a.m. and dusk. They began humming melodies that made the hairs on grown men's necks rise. It wasn't just mystery anymore. It was ritual. The Granger family wasn't a family. It was a gate. And something on the other side was slowly beginning to knock. The knocking wasn't metaphorical anymore. By June of 1879, neighbors, those few who hadn't sold their land and fled, began to report a disturbing phenomenon. Not screams, not howls, but a low rhythmic thud echoing through the valley at irregular hours of the night, always from the direction of the Granger estate, always in sets of 4, like something with intention. One old trapper, Jeremiah Banks, swore he saw the ground near the Granger cornfield pulse, as if something massive beneath the surface was shifting, breathing. He told this to a federal agent who'd come to investigate the land acquisition rumors. The next day, Jeremiah was found face down in the river, eyes wide open, no wounds, no water in the lungs, just gone. But the townsfolk began to put the pieces together. The twins didn't walk the way children did. Their steps were too synchronized, too precise, like metronomes, like pendulums. And those knocks, they always came after a certain behavior, the girls humming, drawing strange circles, or, most terrifying of all, when they would sit perfectly still and simply smile. That smile became a signature. It never reached their eyes. It wasn't joy. It was memory. As if they were remembering something that hadn't happened yet. As if time itself was folding around them like paper, bending, breaking, reforming. Then came the blackout, June 17, 1879. Every lamp in town, every lantern, every stove fire, snuffed out at once. Even the moon disappeared behind thick, unnatural clouds. Horses panicked, dogs howled, and a sound rose from the direction of the Granger property that no one could describe. Not a roar, not thunder, not even a scream. It was like teeth grinding through the earth. It lasted 6 minutes, and when it ended, the girls were gone. Vanished from their locked room, leaving behind only 3 things. A charred outline of 4 small figures, res on the wooden floor. A single word scratched into the glass window pane, soon, and a smell, iron and orchids, that would linger for months. The house was sealed, the family silenced. Government men arrived within days, erasing everything they could. But not everyone forgot. Not everyone believed it was over, because the rhythm never stopped. The thudding still came, fainter now from deeper below, but still there, still knocking, still waiting. And some say that when the wind is still, if you listen hard enough, you can hear them breathing. You would think the horror ended there, but the Granger mystery only deepened, because what followed wasn't silence, it was surveillance. From 1880 onward, the land was no longer farmland. It was a containment zone, quietly fenced, subtly guarded, always under observation by men who wore no uniforms, carried no papers, and answered to no one. Locals came to call them the gray suits. They spoke little, smiled even less, and documented everything. One local hunter, Samuel Dade, swore he saw them lowering metal rods into the earth near the old Granger cellar. The rods would tremble, sometimes hum. He also swore they took soil samples, and that those samples moved in their containers. Then Samuel vanished too. In his abandoned cabin, they found hundreds of drawings pinned to the walls, identical sketches of 4 figures standing in a perfect square, holding hands, with eyes like polished onyx, black mirrors, watching. But it wasn't just the land they monitored, it was the people. One by one, anyone who'd ever worked the Granger estate was either relocated, silenced, or committed. Several claimed to hear music at night, high-pitched and unnatural, like a music box in reverse. Others swore the twins would appear in their dreams, standing at the foot of their beds, whispering backwards. And always, always, knocking. 4 knocks. Not 3, not 5. 4. Then in 1882, a document leaked, a single page, typed in a language no one recognized. Linguists tried to decode it, failed, until a Cherokee scholar noticed something peculiar. The symbols weren't letters, they were frequencies. Sound, as if the page wasn't meant to be read, it was meant to be played. When converted into audio, the file produced a strange rhythmic beat, like a heartbeat made of static and metal. And that's when the seizures started. Everyone present when the audio was played fell unconscious. 2 never woke up. The government seized the page immediately, labeled it Phenomenon Granger Class Echo. From that moment forward, any mention of the quadruplets was scrubbed from libraries, county records, and newspapers. They were officially deemed a mass delusion event. But the land still stands, untouched, unpurchased, unnamed. A place where no birds fly, where compasses spin, where machines fail. And if you camp too close on a windless night, you'll hear a knock, then another, then another, then one more. It was supposed to be just another academic dare. In the spring of 1883, 3 university students from Boston, 2 men and 1 woman, traveled west to write a thesis on mass rural delusion and myth-making. Their destination? The long-abandoned Granger estate. They were skeptics, rationalists, minds sharpened by reason, not folklore. But what they didn't realize was this. The Granger estate doesn't respond to belief. It responds to presence. They camped just beyond the northern edge of the ruined foundation. The first night passed without incident. On the second night, they set up strange Victorian-era equipment, a device that recorded vibrations in soil, and another that photographed in total darkness using a rare phosphorus technique. What they captured was never made public. But we know this. By the third night, only one of them remained alive. His name was Thomas Bell. He stumbled into a train station 30 miles from the estate, clothes torn, eyes bloodshot, muttering the same phrase over and over. They didn't grow. They were assembled. When authorities questioned him, he couldn't recall what had happened. He couldn't remember the names of his friends. He couldn't even remember his own. But he did remember one thing. The sound. 4 knocks, in perfect rhythm, repeating, non-stop, growing louder the closer they got to the old Granger cellar. He said the woman, Clara, approached first. She said she saw 4 shapes, small like children, but they weren't walking. They were gliding, as if pulled by strings. He ran. She didn't. Thomas never spoke again after that night. Not once. He lived the rest of his days in an asylum on the Massachusetts coast. Every wall in his room was covered with drawings, not of children, but of organs, human hearts, lungs, spines, each labeled with strange symbols, none from any known language. But in each drawing, the numso bear 4 ventricles, 4 lobes, 4 spines, as if the body itself had been rewritten to fit a pattern. A Granger pattern. When Thomas died, they burned everything. The bed, the floor, even the walls of his room were sanded down. But the orderly who cleaned the ashes swore he found something in the debris. 4 small teeth, perfectly preserved, childlike, but not human. By 1884, the Granger name was no longer whispered. It was sealed. Families who had once lived within 20 miles of the estate had packed up and vanished. Even the railroad, once proud of its westward expansion, redirected all routes away from the area. Official maps erased the name Granger altogether. But legends? They multiply in silence. One of those legends revolves around Father Elias March, a traveling priest dispatched from St. Louis to investigate what the church called persistent whispers of preternatural origin. They had received multiple confessions from unrelated townspeople, each describing dreams of faceless children and an underground room filled with singing teeth. Elias, unlike many others, kept meticulous records. His journal, later found buried under a collapsed church bell in Arkansas, contained a detailed timeline of his 7-day stay in Granger. Day 1, he arrived. The town was dead quiet. Birds no longer sang. Day 2, he found the well. Inside were bones, too small to be adult, but shaped too perfectly to be animal. Day 3, he dug near the ruins of the Granger cellar. He heard something, a faint voice, not outside, but inside his own chest. It whispered in perfect Latin, "We were made, not born." Day 4, he began sleepwalking. He carved symbols into the trees, symbols that mirrored the ones Thomas Bell had drawn in the asylum. Day 5, he found the nursery. Beneath the collapsed structure of the original Granger home, there was a hidden chamber. Walls lined with mirrors. On the ceiling, hundreds of names scratched backward in glass, and in the center, a chair, made entirely of human bones, 4 legs, 4 arms, 4 skulls fused into one. He sat in it, and that was his last journal entry. When the church sent a recovery team 2 weeks later, all they found was his coat, nailed to a tree in a perfect square formation, 4 naipsihos. Ills, 1 in each corner. Inside the coat pocket was a page from the book of Genesis, with a single word rewritten. And God assembled man. No body, no blood. Just echoes in the ground that, when listened to closely, sounded like humming. 4 notes, over and over. Even the wind in Granger moves in 4s. And somewhere beneath that cursed soil something watches, waiting. Not for worship, but for return. It is now 2025. The Granger estate no longer appears on satellite imagery. Google Earth glitches when you try to zoom in. Locals refer to the land as the silent zone. No birds, no insects, just dirt, and an odd metallic hum beneath your feet if you listen long enough. The land has changed hands 31 times in the last century. Every new owner signed under false names. None stayed longer than a year. Each vanished, sold, or burned everything they owned. One even wrote in his journal, "The mirrors don't show my reflection anymore, only 4 shadows behind me." And what of the quadruplets? Officially, they were declared dead in 1880, but no graves were ever found. No death records, no autopsies. Unofficially, 4 boys, identical, silent, and pale, were spotted in random parts of the country. One in Chicago in 1912, standing motionless outside a church with his head tilted upward as if hearing a song no one else could. One in Mississippi in 1933, staring into a well for 14 hours without blinking. 2 were seen together in 1966 during a blackout in Detroit, caught on a security camera for exactly 4 frames. Then nothing. Each time, investigators found the same thing left behind, a bone, not aged, not fossilized, but impossibly fresh, still warm, as if pulled from a living body, and always in sets of 4. Some say the boys are not human, that they were experiments born not of biology but of symbols, sound, and sacrifice. Others say they are echoes, psychic remnants of a ritual that never finished, that something used the Grangers to build a vessel for itself. Not a child, not a demon, something older, something that remembers what it was like before the first word was spoken, before language gave man the illusion of control, before names, before science, before God. Only one truth remains. The story of the Granger quadruplets was never about children, was about design. 4 beings, 4 bodies, 1 mind. And now, nearly a century and a half later, the pattern is repeating. Across the country, 4 identical children have been born again, on the same day, in the same hour, with the same mark, a perfect square of teeth imprinted across their shoulder blades. Authorities call it coincidence. But you and I? We know better. This was never a story. It was a blueprint, and it's been waiting for this moment to begin again.